Hey everyone, I hope everyone's doing well today. This is Real Mob Stories, and I'm your host, James Proctor. I'm excited to bring you the results of my deep dive investigation into the infamous William Joseph Bentvena, aka Billy Bats, according to Henry Hill, who was a character in the 1990 movie Goodfellas. I guarantee you that what I'm going to bring out today on this show will blow your mind, as it'll prove that what we've been told for the past 30 plus years was a lie. The movie Goodfellas was based upon the book Wise Guy, written by Nicholas Pileggi, with much of the information in the book and the subsequent movie being given to him by Lucchese associate and turncoat Henry Hill. Who was Billy Bats? Was he a made guy in the Gambino family? Is his killing the reason that Tommy DeSimone was taken out? What do we even know about this guy, Billy Bats? I'm happy that we can bring some further information on William Bentvena that hasn't been presented before. I've scraped a lot of resources, including court documents, newspaper articles, and even conversations with people in the family. I can tell you one thing, that Henry Hill is an unreliable narrator. We've been lied to for nearly 35 years by Henry Hill, and I have a lot of evidence supporting this. Before we get started, please do me a big favor and hit the like button. And also, if you're not subscribed to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor, please do so, as I bring you stories from the world of the American Mafia that you won't find anywhere else. Without further delay, on to our feature presentation. William Joseph Bentvena was born in Brooklyn, New York on February 22, 1933, to Joseph L. Bentvena and Alice Bentvena, whose maiden name was Fulham. William, who went by Billy, was the second of at least 4 children. William had an older brother named Lawrence, who was 1 year older than Billy, and 2 younger sisters, Maureen and Veronica. Billy was Sicilian on his father's side and English on his mother's side. Billy's father, Joseph, was born in Brooklyn in 1910, and Billy's grandfather immigrated to the United States sometime in the early 1900s. His name was Lorenzo, but the last name was actually Bentvena, not Bentvena. We know that when immigrants would enter the United States, the officers wouldn't always write down the correct name, as many of these immigrants couldn't speak English. So we know that Billy's grandfather was born in Sciacca, Agrigento, Sicily in 1884, and came from a family of fishermen. He moved to Brooklyn in the early 1900s and stayed in Brooklyn his whole life. Billy still had relatives back in Sicily, including artists who did sculptures named Filippo Bentvena. Filippo had lived in New York for 7 years between 1912 and 1919, and had a string of bad luck. The woman he wanted to marry broke his heart, and then he gets into a fight and suffers a head injury, which led to him having emotional and mental problems. So he was tired of the States, and he returned to Italy. However, he had skipped out on the military draft that Mussolini had when he came to the United States, so he faces a prison sentence. But he was declared insane, and he bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of Sciacca and built a cabin where he lived alone and started carving heads from the rocky outcroppings on his property. Resembling people he had met in America and Italy, Filippo spent the next 35 years sculpting until his garden had reached a total of more than 1,000 heads. His eccentric behavior gave him the nickname of the village madman. After Filippo passed away in 1967, his family made his garden a tourist site and was renamed the Enchanted Castle, and is a major tourist draw in this southern Sicilian village. Billy had several aunts and uncles in the United States, Ireland, and Sicily. When Billy was 2, his parents took him and his brother Lawrence back to Sicily for a trip to visit family. When they returned from Sicily, they lived at 72-22 Birchall Avenue in Arverne, Queens, which is close to Rockaway. At some point during World War II, the Bentvenas moved to Valley Stream, Long Island, where he still has relatives to this day. Valley Stream's in Nassau County. What we know about Billy growing up is that he was a small, skinny kid, but he was good with his hands. In fact, when he was 16 years old, Billy was part of the Golden Gloves, and we know that he made it to at least the semifinals in the 1949 Long Island Golden Gloves Championship out at the Hampstead Garden. He represented Elmont, which is a part of Queens close to his home in Valley Stream, in the 126-pound weight class. We don't know if Billy graduated from high school, but we know that at some point in the 1950s he became a truck driver. By 1957, Billy was 23 years old and he was living on 111 East Mojera Street in Valley Stream. On January 4th, 1957, it's reported in Newsday that Billy was arrested in his home on a charge of possession of marijuana. According to the report in Newsday, police found a small box in the home of William Bentvena that contained enough marijuana to make about 10 cigarettes, which would be considered about 5 grams and probably a street value in today's terms of $50 to $100. William Bentvena told police that he had bought the weed in New York City some time ago and was just keeping it around. According to police, detectives from the 110th Squad in New York visited Billy to ask him about a holdup that had taken place earlier, and that's when they found the marijuana. So what we can surmise from this article is that Billy by this time was known as a stick-up guy, and this particular incident took place in northern Queens in the area of Corona and Elmhurst. He's also apparently at least a partaker of marijuana and possibly a distributor. In 1958, 24-year-old Billy gets married to a 19-year-old woman named Patricia McGovern. Patricia was born October 13, 1938, and died on September 5, 2009 at the age of 70. Patricia remarried after Billy died to a guy named Marty Eisenberg. Billy and Patricia had 2 boys. The oldest is William, who was born on April 10, 1959, and the youngest was Thomas, born August 14, 1962. William died on July 31, 2015, at the age of 56, while Thomas is still alive and living in Valley Stream, and from what I can see would be 62 years old. The next major event in the life of Billy takes place when he's on trial for conspiracy and narcotics distribution in 1960. This case goes through a mistrial, a second trial, and an appeal where Billy's convictions overturned. So to give you context, we'll discuss what was going on with organized crime at the time and how Billy got involved in this narcotics ring. We need to go to the year 1957. Billy's 23 years old. In the world of organized crime, 1957 is one of the most infamous years in the history of the American Mafia. The commission was created in 1931, and in the first 20 years of its existence, things ran peacefully within the boss ranks. However, in 1951, the bad relationship between Gambino boss and founder Vincent Mangano and underboss Albert Anastasia soured even worse. Through the years, the two of them would have heated disagreements that almost led to physical fights. Anastasia resented Mangano, and especially the close ties he had with Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano of the Genovese family. On April 15, 1951, Vincent Mangano goes missing, and his body is never found but is presumed dead. Vincent's brother Philip was discovered in Jamaica Bay. Both were killed on orders of Albert Anastasia, but Albert Anastasia didn't get approval to kill Mangano. The rules were that any boss, underboss, or consigliere or whack must be done under the approval of the commission. This did not take place, but Albert Anastasia told the commission that Mangano and his brother was trying to kill him, but he never admitted to taking out Mangano. Frank Costello and Joe Bonanno accepted Anastasia as boss. Costello needed an ally in his internal strife with Vito Genovese, and Joe Bonanno simply wanted to avoid a mob war. So Anastasia is made boss of the Gambino family. The conflict between Genovese and Frank Costello continues, and Vito Genovese realizes he has to kill Costello to control the family. Genovese started working behind the scenes to get support to eliminate Anastasia. Anastasia was a brutal boss and considered unstable and was bringing pressure on all the New York families. Genovese was the one telling the other bosses that Anastasia had been selling memberships to his crime family for upwards of $50,000. Rumors had that Anastasia was losing large amount of money at the racetrack. Through the years, Genovese became close to an Anastasia capo regime named Carlo Gambino. Now we're in 1957. In April of 1957, we had the Montreal meeting, which is where the Bonanno family talks about bringing heroin from Canada and distributing it in the United States, and Carmen Galante is set up to oversee the whole operation for all the mob. But for all this to work out, things have to calm down within the New York Five families because war is close to breaking out. Vito Genovese decides to make a move to take over the family and gives a former boxer and Greenwich crew member, Vincent Chin Gigante, the contract to take out boss Frank Costello. On May 2, 1957, Chen shoots and wounds Costello outside his apartment building, grazing Costello in the head. On the brink of a mob war between the Genovese and Gambino families, Joe Bonanno steps in with a sit-down and persuades Anastasia not to go to war against the Genovese family. It was self-serving for Bonanno because he knew Frank Costello didn't agree with the narcotics trade, and by convincing Costello to retire would bring in a new boss, Vito Genovese, who would be partners in the heroin endeavors. Frank Costello indeed does retire and relinquish control of the family to Vito Genovese. Anastasia tells the commission that it was Frank Scalise, his underboss, that was selling buttons, and it was agreed as well that Scalise would be eliminated. Also, a decision was made to close the books due to the embarrassment of selling buttons, which would mean no widespread mafia inductions for the next 20 years. On June 17, 1957, Frank Scalise is murdered along with his brother Joseph, all on the orders of Albert Anastasia. Anastasia has a false sense of security, thinking he could work with Genovese. However, Vito's plotting with Carlo Gambino to have Anastasia whacked. It's October 1957, and Joe Bonanno leaves for a series of meetings in Palermo, Sicily, to discuss setting up the illegal heroin trade network between the American and Sicilian mafia, since they have the network in place between Canada and the United States from April. These meetings took place at the Grand Hotel at Des Palmas in Palermo. At this meeting was Joe Bonanno, his underbosses and advisors Carmine Galante, John Bonventre, and Frank Garofalo. You also had this mysterious Santo Sorge, who was a Sicilian mafioso who lived in the United States, the Sicilian hitman Gaspar Magadino, Salvatore Vito Vitale, and John DeBella, a Bonanno who was in Wisconsin and owned Grande Cheese Company. Lucky Luciano, who had been exiled to Italy, was there as well as several Sicilian mafiosos. While Bonanno was out of the country, the plans were executed to take out Albert Anastasia. Carlo Gambino gave the contract to a Gambino hit team, and on October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia entered the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. As Anastasia relaxed in the barber's chair, two men wearing scarves covering their faces rushed in, shoved the barber out of the way, and started firing at Anastasia. As the bullets were fired, Anastasia lunged at what he thought were his killers, but were actually the gunman's reflections in the wall mirror of the barbershop. Anastasia falls dead, being clipped with 5 bullets. Although the commission only meets as a group every 5 years, and had just met the year before, where the biggest decision was adding the Philadelphia and Detroit crime families as voting members of the commission, there was a need for an emergency meeting. Originally it was to be held in Chicago, but Genovese pushed for this meeting taking place at Joe the Barber Barbara's farm in Appalachian, upstate New York. This emergency commission meeting would be the way to legitimize and approve the assent of both Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino. There were other topics to discuss, including casinos in Cuba and the new network to distribute heroin. As we know, the meeting did not occur. It was a disaster as 60 mafia members get apprehended. The point of all this history is to show everybody that the mob was in the midst of big changes, and the events that got Billy pinched was a result of these decisions being made. The Montreal meeting that took place in April of 1957 is what started the network of drugs being distributed from Canada to the United States. It started off with David Smith, a Canadian with underworld connections, and Bonanno member Frank Mancino in Montreal. Mancino asked Smith to make a run into New York with him, and Smith agreed. The following day, Mancino took Smith to an apartment in Montreal where they met the Bonanno underboss, Carmine Galante, and a Bonanno named Salvatore Giglio with the Montreal faction, being represented by Frank Catroni, Vic Catroni, and a person identified only as Angelo. Galante picked up a small suitcase, put it on the coffee table, and opened it. Mancino examined its contents, which were clear plastic bags containing a white powder. As Smith and Mancino were leaving with the suitcase, they encountered Giuseppe Pepe Catroni and Genovese guide Joseph Vecchio. Smith and Mancino drove to New York to Frank's Bar and Grill in Brooklyn, where Mancino took the suitcase of narcotics, and Smith returned to Montreal. This was the first run to take place. So Carmine Galante was the underworld's heroin czar for the United States, and distribution to New York was controlled by the Bonanno, Lucchese, Genovese, and Gambino families, with Giovanni Big John Ormento, a capo regime in the Lucchese family, the major New York distribution guy. Armento was an old-time dope guy that was close to fellow Lucchese capos Carmine Tremonti and Paul Vario. Armento actually had a crew in Long Island, Queens, which included Valley Stream, the suburb Billy lived. He had a number of wise guys with each family except for the Colombos that were involved with distributing heroin in New York. This network includes hubs in the city where heroin would be sent to, which include places such as Frank's Bar and Grill in Brooklyn, Viveris on the Lower East Side, Squeeze In Bar in Manhattan on East 4th Street, and the 1717 Club in Brooklyn, plus a Coney Island hotel. The guy, Dave Smith from Canada, would bring the heroin to New York. This network expanded to include dozens of wise guys, associates, and even semi-independent drug dealers. On January 19, 1959, Richard McGovern, who was a cousin of Billy's wife Patricia, acted as a middleman or contact for a heroin buyer named Giorgio and facilitated the logistics of the transaction. When Billy and his friend William Strusieri arrived at the location with the heroin, which was 525 East 88th Street, McGovern described them as the delivery boys to Giorgio, and he took charge of coordinating the final steps of the delivery. Unfortunately, Giorgio was an undercover agent with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. McGovern would pay Billy and William $25 each for each delivery of drugs. In addition, there was a guy named Samuel Monastersky, whose role was to coordinate with the suppliers of drugs from the mob. McGovern would pay Samuel $200 for each transaction. Further investigation revealed that Monastersky was receiving heroin from Philip and Marcantonio Orlandino. On February 14, 1959, U.S. narcotics agents in New York City police arrested Monastersky, McGovern, William Strusieri, and Billy. That same evening, officers arrested the Orlandino brothers, seizing a total of 11 kilograms of heroin. The search disclosed a Railway Express receipt for a package to one E.K. Brown of Chicago. Upon receipt of this information, the Chicago office of the FBN arrested Eula Brown and seized close to 2 kilograms of heroin, which she said she was holding for Wilbur Holmes, brother of notorious narcotic trafficker Auckland Holmes. Auckland Holmes was arrested on February 19th when he called for the package. The mob blamed Richard McGovern for introducing undercover agents into the network, and a contract was put on him. Richard McGovern makes a run for it. He gets a fake identity, changing his name to John Ahern, going to Acapulco, Mexico. However, 2 months later, on April 26, 1959, Richard McGovern is found dead in a ditch with bullet wounds to the head. Most likely someone ratted Richard out, as is a mob execution-style hit. There's no evidence, but the person closest to Richard might have been Billy, since they were related by marriage. 29 or so defendants get charged in the conspiracy to distribute narcotics. David Smith, who was the main mule between Montreal and the United States, would turn rat. The first trial in 1960 ends in a mistrial and then in a retrial in 1962. Most of the defendants get sentenced to prison anywhere between 15 and 40 years. Billy got 35 years, but the next year he seeks an appeal of his conviction. The courts ruled that Billy shouldn't have been charged with conspiracy because he was solely a courier, so he doesn't have to go to prison. Now we move forward a few years to 1966. The last news event that involved Billy Batts occurred in 1966, and this was 3 years after he beat the drug conspiracy charges. Billy Batts was at the house of Michael Corcione Sr. Michael Corcione Jr., who was Mikey Bones, was there when the group was arrested. Mikey Bones was part of Paul Vario's crew. Frank Monzo, a.k.a. Frankie the Wop, was also there, and he was another Vario guy. Frank oversaw the family interest at JFK International Airport in Queens and served as a union delegate in the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America and controlled Local 295 and owned 2 trucking companies, LVF Air Cargo Incorporated and LVF Airport Services Incorporated at JFK. The charges were dropped, but police were saying that Frankie the Wop's father was running card games out of his basement. Fast forward to 1970, and we'll discuss the incident which led to the death of Billy by the hands of Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke, if we're to believe Henry Hill's account. Henry Hill mentions that Billy had just been released from prison in 1970 and there was a welcome home party for Billy. I've dug deep and can't find any records of Billy Bentvena being in prison after getting out in 1963 as part of that narcotics case. We know that in 1966, Billy wasn't in prison because he was caught up in the gambling case at Frankie the Wop's father's house. This doesn't mean that Billy wasn't in prison at some point after 1966, but the records aren't there. If he is in prison, it wouldn't have been a federal case because we do have records of federal inmates from the 1960s. Most likely, he would have been in the New York Department of Corrections. What we know at Bentvena is that early in his career, he was a truck driver and he was involved in stick-ups. We also know that he gravitated to becoming a low-level mule for his cousin by marriage, Richard McGovern. He was also involved in low-level street activities such as gambling and dope. There's no evidence that he was any sort of big earner, so whatever he got pinched for, if it's true, he wasn't in prison long. So this statement by Henry Hill that William Bentvena has been released from prison might be true, but I have no evidence. Here's the account according to the Mafia memoir Wise Guy. Henry Hill described a welcome home party for William Bentvena at Robert's Lounge, a nightclub owned by Jimmy Burke. Bentvena jokingly asked DeSimone if he still shined shoes, which DeSimone perceived as an insult, and then leaned over to Hill and Burke. "I'm going to kill that fuck." 2 weeks later, on June 11, 1970, Bentvena was at the Suite, which was Hill's nightclub in Queens. With the club nearly empty, DeSimone pistol whipped Bentvena, yelling, "Shine these fucking shoes," before beating him bloody. After Bentvena was severely beaten and presumed dead, DeSimone, Burke, and Hill placed his body in the trunk of Hill's car, stopping at DeSimone's mother's house for a knife, lime, and a shovel. Hearing sounds from the trunk, they realized that Bentvena was still alive, so DeSimone and Burke beat him to death with a shovel and a tire iron. Burke had a friend who owned a dog kennel in upstate New York, and Bentvena was buried there. About 3 months after Bentvena's murder, Burke's friends sold the dog kennel to housing developers, and Burke ordered Hill and DeSimone to exhume Bentvena's corpse and dispose of it elsewhere. In Wise Guy, Hill said the body was eventually crushed in a compactor at a New Jersey junkyard, which was owned by Clyde Brooks. However, on the commentary for the film Goodfellas, he states that Bentvena's body was buried in the basement of Robert's Lounge, and that was only later put in the compactor. William Bentvena died at the age of 37 and left behind his wife and 2 boys. His son William was 11 and his son Thomas was 8 when this happened. So we have a couple of different accounts by the unreliable narrator Henry Hill. Something a lot of people don't realize is at the time of this incident, Thomas DeSimone had just turned 20 years old. Tommy was known as a hothead. He was introduced to the Paul Vario crew in 1965 when he was 15 years old. At the time, Hill described DeSimone as a skinny kid who was wearing a Wise Guy suit and a pencil mustache. What we can tell, DeSimone was involved in the truck hijackings the crew were involved in, selling stolen property, extortion, and fraud. He was an enforcer type. Tommy ends up becoming a tall and muscular kid as he grew up and was good with both his hands and a gun. Hill states that Tommy would carry his weapon of choice, a .38 caliber revolver, and a brown paper bag. We're told of numerous other murders by Tommy DeSimone. You had Michael Spider Gianco, who was a bartender at a card game that was shot 3 times in the chest and killed over an insult. Jimmy Burke was supposedly livid, but there's no evidence this guy ever was a real person. Maybe a bartender did get killed, but it seems that the guy Spider was made up by Henry Hill. Then you had another associate named Stanley Diamond that was a warehouse foreman that Jimmy Burke had an issue with. He sent Tommy to Stanley's home in New Jersey for a beating, but ended up killing him. Then you had Jimmy Burke supposedly ordering the murder of his best friend, Dominic Remo Cersante. Burke thought that Remo had become an informant, and supposedly he was taken out by Tommy in a car using piano wire to choke him to death. Next, on December 18, 1974, Tommy killed Ronald Foxy Girothi. Foxy was a close friend to John Gotti and was part of the Bergen crew. Tommy had dated Foxy's sister and was abusive to her, beating her up. Foxy was livid and was going to kill Tommy for it. However, Tommy caught wind of it and went over to Foxy's apartment and killed him first. There are several theories on what happened to Tommy DeSimone. We do know that he was killed sometime around Christmas or early January 1979. His wife Angela reported him missing and hadn't seen him for several weeks. We're told that Tommy was told that he was going to get made and was told to dress up. This makes sense because mob inductions did typically happen around Christmas. There are still several stories on what happened to Tommy and who was involved, but it's a mystery still. The most likely scenario is that he was killed by Paul Vario's son Peter and Bruno Foxiolo. Usually these things happen within the family and within the crew. As far as John Gotti being involved, there's no evidence of this. Also, there's a story where Tommy Agro supposedly claimed that he did the deed because he had killed the brother Anthony, who had become an informant, and wanted to go for the Damone trifecta and take out the other brother, Robert. However, that account came from a mob informant named Joseph Joe Dogs Lanuzzi. I wouldn't consider his account factual. Understand, Henry Hill was trying to sell books, and he made up stories or embellished stories to make them more interesting than they really were. Was John Gotti upset about the murder of Foxy in 1974? Of course. But it was Paul Vario making the decision to get rid of Tommy, who had become too erratic and violent. So now we have given all this backstory and showed all this evidence, and now it's time to answer some questions. First of all, was William Bentvena a made guy with the Gambino family? There's no evidence that even suggests that William Bentvena was a made guy. Understand that the books were closed in 1957. William Bentvena was 23 years old when the books were closed. We have records of most of the mob guys who got made in the 1950s, and there's never any mention of a William Bentvena being made. Also, at the time the books were open in the 1950s, before 1957, the requirement was that you had to be 100% Italian on both your mother and father's side. As I've shown earlier, William Bentvena was Italian on his father's side, but English on his mother's side. He wasn't eligible to get made. Also, look at the level of criminal activities that William Bentvena was involved in. He was caught up in that huge narcotics case in 1960 and ends up getting the sentence overturned in 1963. We only see evidence of Bentvena being involved for a couple of months in 1959. We know that Bentvena got introduced to the ring by his cousin by marriage, Richard McGovern. We know his role, Bentvena's, was the lowest level of all the 29 people indicted. He was a drug runner that was paid $25 for each delivery by his cousin. We know about a drug run on 88th Street in Manhattan in January 1959, and then another run in Connecticut on Valentine's Day 1959 where he was arrested. A made guy in 1959 wouldn't be the one doing such low-level activities. He wouldn't be under the direction of another associate. Even Richard McGovern wasn't very connected. No evidence anywhere shows that William Bentvena was a made guy. Now, regarding Bentvena being part of the Gambino family and close to John Gotti, this is also false. All evidence points to William Bentvena being a low-level associate in the Lucchese family and Paul Vario's crew. We know that distribution of the drugs in 1959 was ran by the Lucchese Capo regime, Big John Oromento. Although Bonanno Carmine Galante was the ringleader of this relationship with Montreal and the Catronis, it was the Lucchese Big John who ran the distribution to the drop spots at clubs where the drugs would then go to dealers. In the 1966 arrest for gambling at Frankie the Wop's father's house, all the people arrested were Lucchese members or associates. We know all the people that were around John Gotti and the Bergen crew, and there's never a mention of William Bentvena. As far as the coming home party in 1970 from prison, either this is Henry Hill embellishing, or William did come home from a short stint in prison and there was a party for him. I don't think that even this guy was high enough on the food chain to warrant a party. I just think as an associate on the fringe of the Vario crew, he would come in from time to time to Robert's Lounge. Why would he be going to Jimmy Burke's club, Robert's Lounge, and then Henry Hill's place, the Suites? These were both Lucchese places. We have no evidence of anybody from any other family witnessing what happened between Tommy DeSimone and Billy. Understand that Tommy had just turned 20, and it would make sense that Billy would have remembered Tommy's shining shoes as a younger kid. What we can conclude is that William Bentvena was a half-Italian, low-level associate of the Paul Vario crew that probably did most of his activities in North Queens and Long Island. He was not a major player in the Vario crew. And regarding the incident where we have Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke being involved in Bentvena's death, I don't believe that Jimmy Burke would have risked his life and his reputation killing a made guy, especially one that was supposedly a friend of his friend, John Gotti. Jimmy Burke was ruthless, but he also followed the rules. Would he have went along with a 20-year-old kid killing a made member of another crime family that could have risked a war? Not at all. The reason is that William Bentvena wasn't a Gambino-made guy. He was a Lucchese associate in that crew that was more of a fringe or outside player. And now we have the biggest piece of this whole story. We're going to tell you that William Bentvena wasn't even Billy Batts. I spoke with the family of William Bentvena off the record, and I was told that William was never called Billy Batts. He was called Billy by his friends. There are no court documents or anything that actually uses the name Billy Batts to refer to William Bentvena. All references to William Bentvena being called Billy Batts was from Henry Hill. However, I've also uncovered the mystery of who the real Billy Batts is. Yes, there was a Billy Batts, and he was part of the Gotti crew. However, this Billy Batts was not a made guy either. I even have a photo of the real Billy Batts. The real Billy Batts was a Gambino Bergen crew associate named William Battista. His nickname was Billy Batts because of his name, William being shortened to Billy, and Battista, Battista, being shortened to Batts. So he's called Billy Batts. So who is this William Battista, a.k.a. Billy Batts, that was in the Bergen crew and was around John Gotti? William Battista, also known as Source BQ in FBI files, was an associate of the Gambino family and is best known for his connections with the Gotti crew. He became part of the Bergen crew in the 1960s and was close to Willie Boy Johnson. Battista became an informant for the FBI starting in 1976 and was paid $5,000 for his services. Battista provided information to the FBI that helped piece together the intricate workings of the Gambino crime family. His cooperation was essential for investigators who were targeting key figures, including Gotti, and his testimony shed light on illegal activities like loan sharking, extortion, and drug trafficking within the organization. Although his initial cooperation began in 1976, he continued to provide information into the early 1980s as the FBI intensified its crackdown on the Gambinos. It is rumored that Battista provided insights that helped set the stage for subsequent cases against mob figures. In 1986, he was supposed to testify in a Gotti trial, and Battista mysteriously disappeared, leading many to speculate that he'd either been killed by the Gambino family for his cooperation or placed into the witness protection program due to the risk he faced. So the real Billy Batts was this guy, William Battista. Why did Henry Hill state that William Bentvena was Billy Batts? Understand that Henry Hill was an unreliable narrator, and many of his statements in Wise Guy and even later in interviews were wrong and were lies. Henry Hill was a mess. He was a junkie that wasn't good with money and a degenerate gambler. This book, Wise Guy, that Nicholas Pileggi did in 1985 with Henry Hill and then Goodfellas in 1990, brought fame and money to the informant Henry Hill. Henry Hill wasn't involved in everything as he stated in the book and movie. Many of the stories are hearsay. Also, he wasn't sober and he might have gotten confused. It's obviously possible that he could have confused William Bentvena and William Battista. It seems he merged two stories together. He would have possibly known about Battista being an informant. He might have also merged Foxy's murder into this as well, as he knew that Gotti and Foxy were close. I spoke with people, and Gotti never knew William Bentvena. Maybe it's a case of misunderstanding, not sure, by Henry Hill, but he lied so much in Wise Guy and other interviews that you can't believe anything he said. Saying that Tommy DeSimone killed a made guy that was close to John Gotti was probably something he thought would make a good story and help sell books. Okay, after more than 30 years, we finally have some of the mystery solved regarding Billy Batts and William Bentvena. I'm still trying to get photos of William Bentvena. As we know, the widely circulated photo of him is actually Pat the Cat's Burrito, a former Philly guy. And we have this new photo. I'm not sure if it's really Bentvena or not. So I'll continue to see if the family will give me new photos. I know this was a long video, but I wanted to do this the right way. And I'm thinking that you'll find the show interesting. I have to thank my friend who's a source and a researcher on this channel, Tony, for bringing to light the last piece of information on William Battista. It really tied a lot of the missing pieces together. So thank you for watching this exclusive on the real Billy Bats. Let me know what you think now. After 30 years, we have information about William Bentvena and Billy Bats that hadn't been disclosed. What do you think about Henry Hill and his reason for giving false information? If you haven't already, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.